All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks to University of Texas Press for sponsoring this follow-up video. My name is Will Dodson. I'm the co-editor for American Twilight, the cinema of Tobe Hooper. And I'm here with Stan Giesea and Julius Banzon. We're going to do some discussion, some reminiscences, some speculations, some theorizing on several Tobe Hooper projects. Stan's new book, Smoldering Embers, on the set of Tobe Hooper's Spontaneous Combustion, is going to be coming out in about a month on Nineveh Press.
Correct, Nineveh Press.
And Julius Banzon is the webmaster of the Tobe Hooper Appreciation Society, which recently posted a rough cut reconstruction of Spontaneous Combustion, which is really cool to look at. So we're going to talk about all those things. Stan, let's start with you, because you were actually on the set, and you've got some stories to tell. Let me get out of your way.
Well, let me just start, tell you a little something about myself and my experience with Tobe. I think like most of us, I first came across his name, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I saw it first run. That's right, I'm old. Saw it in the theater on a triple bill. I don't know if anyone remembers that there were triple bills in the theaters with Enter the Dragon and Shriek of the Mutilated. And Enter the Dragon was awesome, and Shriek of the Mutilated was ludicrous. But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre kept me up for 3 weeks. So I knew his name quite well, and I kept a lookout for anything that came along. When Salem's Lot came on television, I was first to see it. I had to see it, and it did not disappoint. It still doesn't disappoint. Subsequent to that, Poltergeist, that whole hubbub, I saw Tobe Hooper's name and I had to be there. And as far as I'm concerned, he is the sole director. Shortly after Poltergeist was released, I moved to Los Angeles, and I never imagined that I would ever meet the man, much less work with him. But through a series of connections with friends, my very good friend Eric Lasher, the late great Eric Lasher, who in fact was the photographer who provided the cover photo for American Twilight. We got to meet Tobe. I was an extra in Invaders from Mars. I was one of the many hundreds of Marines. That was a great time. But as a result of my connections with Eric and the unit publicist Scott Holton, I had free reign of the set. So I used to visit the set when they were shooting, when they weren't shooting. I spent a lot of time on the Martian vessel set. It was terrific. It was a dream come true. But also as a result, Eric was an incredibly gregarious person, and he became a very good pal and a champion of Tobe's, and he introduced us. And Eric went off to Texas to do Chainsaw 2. And subsequent to that, when Spontaneous came along, it seemed natural that I would be a part of the team, an objective observer. An objective observer to document and write a book about my experiences on the set. Unfortunately, the film wasn't well received, if received at all, at the time. So there was little need for a book about the making of this film. But as the years passed, and definitely after Tobe passed, interest in his work and his canon has grown exponentially, and there's a lot of interest. And so now my book, Smoldering Embers, should be available for order within a couple of weeks or a month, and that's very exciting. I was also lucky enough to serve the same purpose on I'm Dangerous Tonight and his pilot episode of Nowhere Man, and in various capacities on a few other. I was there for a couple of days on Crocodile. I helped his son Tony build the prototype for the Mangler.
Oh, wow.
This giant model, which was awesome. So all I'm saying is that I had a long and lasting and a deep kind of family friendship with the Hoopers. Tony Hooper is still one of my best friends. I hope he's tuning in. But I guess the big deal for me was Spontaneous Combustion. It was my first real experience on a motion picture from beginning to end. Pre-production, principal photography. I was around a little bit for the editing, and of course the aftermath. So I wrote down my experiences, and if you have any interest, you can pick it up yourself at your local bookstore or at Amazon. If you have any questions for me, Will, I'm happy to do my best to answer.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start with just your recollections on the set. You know, whenever I read interviews or listen to commentaries by actors and crew, they always hail Tobe as a great collaborator. Sometimes with specific stories, sometimes it's just the same old Hollywood line. You know, everybody's wonderful, everybody's great to work with. So I wonder if you have any stories in your head, any recollections of, you know, what Hooper was like when he was running a set. You know, I saw there's an extra on the Scream Factory edition of the Mangler of about 12 minutes of Hooper just behind the scenes, calling out action and cut on a couple of takes, having some discussions with actors, and it looks fascinating because, you know, he's often been kind of referred to as less articulate, but it doesn't seem to be the case when I watch this footage of him actually working on the set. So.
Well, I mean, he did have a very particular way of speaking. I think not inarticulate, but the people he worked with, he often worked with again and again. And so there was a kind of shorthand, especially with his cinematographer, Levy Isaacs, on both Spontaneous and I'm Dangerous Tonight and an episode of Tales from the Crypt. They were old pals from way back when. Levy was the voice of the radio announcer on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So they developed a kind of shorthand. Now, I may not have a very satisfactory answer. The first thing that comes to mind is, as far as collaborating, is, you know, a story that I've only heard, and this is on the set of the original Chainsaw. Daniel Pearl suggested what is now an iconic shot, following Pam from under the swing set up into the house looms in the background. That was something that was not on the schedule. It was something Daniel Pearl came up with, and Tobe immediately recognized how great it was. So more than just a collaborator, when the producers tried to stamp their feet and say, look, we don't have time for this, it's not on the schedule, Tobe basically said, look, we're shooting this. Do what you want. Do whatever you think you have to do. We're going to shoot this shot. So he stood up for his man, and he stood by. And I think that says a lot. And that's very much my experience. Now, I will say that most of the collaboration takes place in meetings prior to shooting. You know, they agree on how we're going to approach this, what the shots might be. Somebody might make a suggestion what equipment we're going to have. But on the set, he was really quite loose, also quite restless. He rarely sat. He was always in motion. When he did sit, he was up again very quickly. Always with his hands on and his ears open, listening for any suggestions. He took suggestions from me. Or at least I'd point something out and he would say, oh, yes or no. There's a great moment in Spontaneous towards the end where Lisa meets Rachel in the parking garage at the end, and Rachel sprays her with a fire extinguisher. You may remember it. But if you look at the film closely, when Rachel sprays the fire extinguisher on her end, it comes out as powder. And when it hits Lisa, it hits her as foam. And I pointed that out to Tobe while we were shooting. I was saying, Tobe, you know, first powder, then foam. And he was like, no notice. But it just, yeah, he just was very easygoing, very approachable. But often you need not approach him. He would be on you, asking you questions. What do you think? But he had a great rapport with most of the technicians on the set. Now the actors, it's a very different thing. You know, you don't collaborate with the actors before you shoot. Once you're on the set, you have to work it out together. And what I observed mostly was very calm conversations, sometimes detailed, sometimes not. And then occasionally he'd play them a bit. There was another moment on Spontaneous where Cynthia Bain was having some difficulty with the scene. And Tobe listened to her for a moment and then just turned and walked away because I think he was manipulating her, you know, letting her find her own way. And I think it worked because, you know, the next shot, she was picture perfect.
Okay.
And in fact, she's quite great in that entire film. I just watched it recently. I just recorded a commentary with John Cribbs of the Pink Smoke podcast. And that was something that we talked about. She is really quite excellent in the role, you know, having to play such absurd things, but with conviction and dynamic. She's terrific in the film. And I think Tobe, in his way, molded that performance.
I mean, it was a tough film to shoot, right? It was kind of on the difficult side.
Well, I didn't feel that from my point of view because it was my first experience. I was very wide-eyed and young, enjoying everything. I had little to do except watch. You know, I was also a videographer, so I took a lot of videotape. So for me, no, it was not a difficult shoot. And in fact, everything seemed quite relaxed with a few occasional issues. We had one point where they had built a model outside Lisa's apartment. There is the town of Trinidad and the cooling towers from the nuclear power plant in the distance. And the crew, the art department, had set up this model, and it simply was not up to snuff. It simply did not work. And Tobe observed it. He was not pleased. So what he did was we shut down production for a day, and they rebuilt it. So one whole day we didn't shoot, so they could spend their time building what I think is a wonderful model. Now it's lovely. It's artificial in a way that's convincing, you know, given the terms of the film itself. So, I mean, Tobe was just a great guy, very soft-spoken, occasionally cantankerous, but never bitter, never. He just loved making movies. He loved to be there, and his enthusiasm was infectious.
Well, since we're talking about spontaneous combustion, I want to maybe bring up some interpretation, some analysis of it. It's one of really actually in this way, Hooper is lucky. Almost all of his films are available on pretty good home media. Spontaneous Combustion, not yet though. There's a Blu-ray that Code Red released that doesn't look great, doesn't have, it looks okay, but it doesn't look great, and it doesn't have any commentaries or interviews. And I'm really interested in hearing your all's takes on the movie. Julius, you referred to it on the website as a borderless soap opera, which is a phrase that I find evocative of so many things. Can you speak to that for a minute and maybe expand on what you mean?
Yeah, Spontaneous has a rough reputation because people don't really know what to do with it. It was really a passion project, I think, for Hooper, because it was like the film he decided to make after his reset following the Cannon films and his time in the studios. And then this is, of course, one of the only films that he has a writing credit on, which is story developing and co-writing the script. So he really wanted to make this film for reasons that, you know, are all representative of who he is as a person. It's not really a horror film. It's not really, as a suspense film, it's kind of all the myriad of reasons people find reasons to criticize the film. It has a number of champions. Kiyoshi Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker, he names that film one of his favorites, and because he says it's the way the film plays out as a drama, and that's like a verbatim quote from him. So he's noticed this kind of way is all about the interactions between the characters, and so that's mainly what I mean. It's about all these characters in relationships. Romantic relationships. It's about this central couple who may be traitors, who may be betraying each other. So it's really in like a very direct way a soap opera. Like you could look at it in the most literal sense that, you know, these people are in these kind of cardboard, no offense to the production designers of the film, but in these kind of artificial sets, you know, yelling at each other, accusing each other of things. And so that's why when you look at what he was trying to do with the film, and there's a whole story behind, you know, what he was actually intending to do with the film versus what resulted. Every cut of the film is his, which there's only one cut of the film. Let's make that clear. And the final cut, theatrical cut, he cut together. He was very proud of. But if you look at the troubled production, it could have been something different. So that's part of the borderlessness, because it's something that can change if you look at it from a different perspective.
Interesting, interesting.
I'm not sure I would call it a troubled production. They made, I think, some pragmatic choices that I don't necessarily agree with, but I understand. They seem to, they had some difficulty with the metaphysical nature of the original cut of his idea, that it was very ephemeral and ethereal, and Brad's, you know, personality would possess others and travel through electrical lines and stuff like that, and not end up in this as this very tactile monster at the end of the film.
Oh, wow.
So that was their choice, you know, and I respect that. That's what they decided to do.
Yeah,
and I, as I've said before, I love all the versions of the film, and I carry them all in my head simultaneously.
Of course, there's only one.
Yeah.
We have to keep on repeating it.
Only one official
Yeah.
version.
Yeah, unless we get another like release the Snyder cut thing on our hands, which but it was a very pragmatic decision to make, and we should be very happy with the film he gave us.
You know, in a long history of portrayals of men who are under an intense amount of mental strain, Brad Dourif's performance in Spontaneous Combustion, literally the sweatiest performance I've ever seen from him. I mean, it looks like real sweat. That's how strained he looked.
I mean,
Occasionally it was.
that's just the main reason to say that Hooper is a good director, because not everyone can, you know, evoke that performance out of people. Like realistic sweat, not everyone can do.
Well, I'll tell you, the Tobe and Brad had a really great relationship on the set. They were like two peas in a pod. You know, Brad would call Tobe boss, and he'd follow him around like a puppy dog sometimes.
Wow.
But well, I do want to say something about availability of Hooper's films.
Sure.
The DVD of Spontaneous Combustion, which is currently available, is really much better than the Blu-ray that's currently available. Absolutely, absolutely. And I would suggest anyone who wanted to see it, get the DVD. It's really, really a beautiful transfer.
It's odd that it's the only film of his that, well, the only somewhat high-profile film of his to not have a quality Blu-ray.
I hope these interviews actually help put some pressure. We're waiting for nice releases of Spontaneous Combustion, The Toolbox Murders, Crocodile, and The Apartment Complex in particular.
Yes.
I think.
I have hours and hours of behind-the-scenes video on Spontaneous Combustion that would
wow.
look great on a Scream Factory release.
Okay.
Anybody out there listening?
Have some listeners out there. I should also mention, speaking of Spontaneous Combustion, one really great essay in our book by Alana Thane, Bad Touches, Spontaneous Combustion in the Aftermath of the Nuclear Family, really gets into like the post-Cold War, Reagan era economics of the family unit, the literal nuclear family. Yeah. Reading that essay really expanded my interpretation of the film. I appreciate it a lot more as a result. So that's great hearing some of these stories and thoughts about the film's construction.
It was an interesting point in when I was doing the commentary with John Cribbs. We talked about the film as a love story or a story of betrayal, and it's barely a love story. I mean, there's no sex scenes, there's no passionate love scenes. There are maybe 2 chaste kisses between them.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting because it's often, or it has been categorized as a love story. And for me, it's a story of betrayal more than anything else. At one point in the film, he turns to Lisa, early in the film, he's talking to his ex-wife, Rachel, his estranged wife. And she asks him how's his relationship going? And he says what he loves most about it is no surprises. And then suddenly, he's nothing but surprises.
Back-ended.
Yeah, it's funny. I write about this in my own essay, and there's Salem's Lot and Spontaneous Combustion both have as one of their central themes these cuckolded men, and in the case of Spontaneous Combustion, really, Brad Dourif is cuckolded twice. Once by his ex-wife, and then once when he discovers the secret, of his current relationship. And similarly to there's like 4 or 5 different cuckolded individuals in Salem's Lot, and with each one the world just unravels a little bit more. I think it's handled similarly in Spontaneous Combustion, just like with each revelation, each betrayal, the flames get more violent in their eruption.
I think that's one very personal aspect of the film. Tobe had many, many women in his life over the course of many years, several marriages. I think he knew of what he spoke, when he's talking about, someone being betrayed, and how that inflames you.
Is that contrary to like popular perception maybe, and I don't know if you'd agree, but there's something, his films are generally very chaste in a way. Like they're not romantic or and whenever there's a couple, you barely get the sense that they're, a sensual couple who enjoys each other's company. And I think that's because like all his films are about the repression of normal feelings. Whether it's masculinity, which is present throughout his films. Leatherface is an arrested male, as you and many authors get into in your book. And so like nothing's successful in terms of human relationships in many of his films.
Yeah.
Well, I would argue that his films are by and large chaste, especially in the case of the canon films, which is, in my opinion, are all about sex.
He's talking about sex.
You anticipate. You anticipate where I was going next. I was going to say, other than off the top of my head, I can think of 3 fairly graphic sex scenes, none of which I would characterize as romantic, and that's in Dead Weight, the Tales from the Crypt episode, Night Terrors, which was not his own material, and then the short film for Body Bags, which is one of the most uncomfortable sex scenes I think I've ever witnessed. But so I think you make a really good point that Hooper's films don't have much romance to them and don't have much romantic or even certainly not any healthy sexual encounters.
It's a matter of none of the men being fully formed human beings.
But Stan,
there's very little normal sexuality.
Right. And Stan, you said in an earlier conversation that you consider the canon films Hooper's sex trilogy, which I thought was a very provocative grouping. And so I wonder if you could expand on that.
Sure. I think, Life Force, I think it's obvious.
Yeah.
It's on the surface, it's very much about sex. But more than that, it's about every imaginable kind of sex. Sadomasochism, homosexuality, voyeurism, some bestiality even. And of course, the most subversive thing about the film, in my opinion, is Matilda May's nudity. Instead of tantalizing your teenage audience with a glimpse of a side boob or some kind of, filmy lingerie, it's just right out there. It's in your face, literally, to the point where it almost gets boring. And that's very subversive, to make a completely nude woman boring. But Life Force is very much sexuality on the surface. It's all about that. It's not about love. It's about lust. He doesn't love the space girl. He is driven to her by this uncontrollable lust.
Yeah, it's almost, it reminds me, now this is a bit of a stretch, but that film always reminds me of Ghostbusters when they're told to choose the matter of their own demise. And so all the guys try not to think of anything, but Dan Aykroyd thinks of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. In Life Force, right, the alien reaches into the men's minds to take on the form that will make them the most vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
And so the alien comes out as this nude woman who completely disarms the men because they're driven by their lust and objectification and whatnot.
It's the male gaze,
Yeah,
it's definitely personified. Absolutely. So yes, Life Force is all about sex, and it's very much on the surface, but it's also subliminal all throughout the film. I mean, the vessel, the space vessel, is penile, and it's kind of like a fallopian tube at the same time. It's full of these little touches, and I think it's a fascination with sex that Tobe had during that period. I think he probably always had a fascination with sex, but it was subdued a bit. Now, Invaders from Mars is a different case entirely. What you have is a child's eye view, and I perceive it as a kind of pre-puberty. You come to the realization at a certain age that your parents are sexual creatures, and that somehow makes them alien to you, and it throws everything that you know about the world into relief. And then, of course, a lot of the imagery in the film is blatantly sexual. The needle device in the space vessel is penile. The Supreme Martian Intelligence is this giant penis emerging from this anal cavity. The inside of the spaceship is like a vulva. I hope I'm not being absurd here.
No, actually,
I see it that way. And the waking up in the middle of the night is a nocturnal emission.
Right.
I think there's a lot going on there that he subversively slipped in.
Oh yeah, and I should mention Chris Wolfter, my co-editor, writes extensively about this imagery in Invaders. So if it's far-fetched, then you're both going down that path.
Yeah, I don't think it's that outre. I think it's
not at all.
This is what occurred to me, having seen the film time and time again.
Yeah.
Now, go ahead, Julie.
To Hooper's credit, he's the one filmmaker maybe who doesn't put in like a literal Oedipal scene. What's the phrase for it? Primal scene. I mean, I just that makes me like the film more. Like, it's not obvious, but it's obvious.
Now, moving on to Chainsaw 2, excuse me.
Which is something I write extensively about in the book as well. So yeah, go for it.
Just that it again is overtly sexual. You have another kind of puberty. You've got Leatherface, Bubba, and his sexual awakening. You also have this kind of feminist manifesto going on where the woman takes the power.
Yeah.
She realizes she has sexual control over the male, and she uses it to her own advantage. And of course, there's that amazing scene, that seduction scene in the storeroom of the radio station, where he places the chainsaw against her pudenda. I mean, it's so overt. I don't see how anyone really couldn't interpret it in this way. Or maybe I just have a sick mind.
No, no, not at all. And you know, throughout the film, and Caroline Williams is so great a stretch. Um, you can see her; she's rebuffing every man who, because every man is kind of harassing her to some degree. LG is constantly trying to put the moves on her, and she very gently rebuffs him. Um, Dennis Hopper is Lefty, doesn't make any sexual overtures towards her, but he tries to manipulate her and
Right.
so with his with his 10-gallon hat and hip holstered chainsaws. I mean, he becomes this complete subversion of the John Wayne cowboy. I mean, instead of John Wayne, you've got Dennis Hopper. I mean, and then Leatherface himself, right? She uses the language of self-defense, right? To kind of talk him down, right?
Well, it's interesting how she gets him off, basically.
Yeah, how good.
Throws him off his game by, arousing him.
Right.
In a very clever way. She's a very
Yeah.
smart woman.
It's a great scene. But then in the underneath Alamo Land, where she kind of talks to him like they're breaking up, saying, "I just don't think this is going to work out." It's so
Are you mad at me?
funny. Yeah.
An entire relationship over the course of the movie.
Oh, it's
I
such
think also
a fantastic.
Jim Sedow as Drayton Sawyer has two great lines in the film that deal directly with sex. And one of them is, sex is, well, no one knows.
Yeah.
But the Sawers family. And the other one is sex, it's a swindle.
Mhm.
And I love that.
Like, what does that mean exactly? Like,
It's a
I
swindle.
think he's right.
it obviously has.
I agree.
Like, there's an outcome most of the time. Yeah.
So that's why it's Tobe Hooper's sex trilogy. You heard it here first, folks.
Actually, the title of my essay in the book is "Sex or the Saw, Boy, What's It Gonna Be?" Which Sedow asks Leatherface right before going into the quote you mentioned. Yeah, fantastic. Now, going back to Invaders, Julius, I want to touch on another interpretive comment that you've made. And I guess it definitely connects to what Stan was talking about with this film being told from and Chris Woofter writes about this as well, with the film being told from the point of view of a burgeoning adolescent. You said that the main philosophical point of this film is the passage of time. And so I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, to be more precise, the cyclical aspect of time is a main point of the film. Going beyond it's the only film of Hooper's that, not the only film, but it's one of the main films of his that most of his films take over a compacted expanse of time. So like he has 24-hour narratives for a lot of his films, Chainsaw, Funhouse, a lot. And this is one of the only ones that takes a little more relaxed approach. And then there's a lot of we could go into regarding this because the film was scripted. The very first draft of the script, it was supposed to be more like that because it was supposed to take place with a flashback structure. The nurse and the boy, they arrive at the military and they recount the events of the day. And that's how the film begins. So we go back to flashbacks, but really it's starting from there and then going up to the military's invasion of the alien stronghold. But Hooper chose he chose this structure that he had the associate directors, the assistant directors, they actually wrote the next draft of the screenplay. And this is the one he chose, which is the one that takes place day after day after day, 3 mornings in the life of this young child. And we don't see that in the theatrical cut because a whole day was removed for the theatrical cut. You can see that extra day in the rough cut, which you can see online. But so that kind of, that's that's what he was going for. He was
Wow.
going for this exploration of how time is kind of like, there's a whole Marxist reading that I could get into, but I won't. But that involves like time being a result of the production process, and how we're all trapped in our time cycles that make us, follow the same indoctrination that everyone in our lives is going through. But in terms of how it reflects on an adolescent, the film itself is about this child using all the symbols around him and manifesting that in this dream, supposedly. And so if you saw the rough cut, the first day involves him being visited by James Caron, the military guy. It involves his disciplinarian teacher. It involves his parents being fun and loving. And so once the aliens come, everything's inverted. And he uses all these elements that he experienced on that first day. And he explores them. And he kind of reveals them to be hostile factors. Like, there's no factor in that film that is fully supportive to a healthy upbringing of a child, except maybe the nurse, his one friend, who's played by his mom in real life. And so there's lots of layers going on.
That's very Freudian.
Yeah, there's lots of layers going on in the film. And time is it's a good outlier in his filmography to study, as something a little more political, actually, than a lot of his other films, even though people don't think it's that.
Exquisite.
I really missed the first 15 minutes of the original cut, because it does establish all of these characters and situations that play a very important part. And it also helps establish the dream narrative. So he takes these elements from his day and incorporates them into what may well be a dream of an invasion. And of course, he's the hero, and he takes the alpha male role and saves the day. And that's, unfortunately, that resonance is missing from the current version.
And to jump the gun real briefly, it's this relationship with his producers, who didn't really ever understand what he was doing. And they imposed on things that kind of remove the point. And so Canon, they can't have a film running over 110 minutes, even though Invaders from Mars is a strangely long film for a child's B feature, but they couldn't run longer than that. So they took out this whole opening scene, and they kind of had to restructure the film against his wishes.
Interesting. Well, that actually gives us a good segue to what we're going to do with our remaining time, which is a few weeks ago we did this live stream event with Scout Tafoya and Joe Bob Briggs, and we had so many things to talk about that we didn't get to answer a lot of the questions that people on the stream were asking. And so we were going to go into a couple of these questions in this video. And one question that several people asked was, why is it that Hooper did or was perceived to have so much trouble with producers? All directors do, but it does seem that Hooper had more than normal. And Joe Bob Briggs, mentioned that he felt like Hooper didn't really have the personality to play the glad-handing Hollywood game, but that doesn't really get into actually working with producers on projects, getting from rough cut to director's cut to theatrical. What do you all think about that question? Any thoughts or insights you might provide?
I think it's a bit of a misapprehension. As you alluded to, most filmmakers at a certain level, they're going to have projects that don't work out, that stall, that get canceled for any number of reasons. I do think there's some truth to this idea that Tobe was not a game player. He was interested in making movies. He was not interested in being in development, you know. And a few of the incidences, there's some real question about what happened there. You know, was he fired? Did he leave? I think he's a very strong-willed person. I know he was a very strong-willed person, and I just think because of perhaps the Poltergeist debacle, people examine his career in a different way, and they try, oh, look here, you know, Eaten Alive, for example, he left early, he left before the film was completed. So therefore, that's some kind of indication of what would happen later with Poltergeist, which is a load of bullshit, if you ask me. Many filmmakers have abandoned many projects. There are plenty of projects in turnaround forever and ever and ever. Tobe wanted to make movies, and so any opportunity he had to actually get his hands dirty on a film set, get his hands on a camera and make a movie, well, he seized on it. And if it looked like it wasn't going to happen, he bounced out. There's a fun story about Venom. Some people talked about the producers were at odds with him. H. Rider Haggard somehow wanted him ousted. But what I heard is that Oliver Reed, who was cast in one of the leads, wanted to play his macho bullshit and wrestle him out, you know, get drunk and wrestle. And Tobe was having none of that. And so.
So my 2 cents, first I'll address the Venom thing. I could get really literal and straight facts with you guys. That happened right after writing the treatment for Poltergeist. He was in London writing the treatment for Poltergeist with Spielberg, and then from there he was already in Elstree because that's where Raiders was being shot. He went on to the sets of Venom, and there's multiple stories. There's I believe in an interview he says the producers were impossible to work with. One of them wanted to get into a fist fight with them. That kind of overlaps with the Oliver Reed story, so nothing's clear ever. But a writer for Venom whose draft of the script was completely thrown out, he just calls the producers real shitheads, and they fired Hooper, Richardson, the DP, and they threw out his script. So nothing was going well with that production, apparently. But I'd like to go back to his relationship with producers, which is, I think producers just didn't know what they were getting into when they started working with Hooper. They saw that he was talented from seeing his work, and they didn't realize that he worked completely differently from industry filmmakers, Hollywood filmmakers. He didn't like set plans. He didn't like not being allowed freedom on the set working with his actors. And so this kind of just made them crazy a lot of the time. I'll share a story that's pretty insider, but he was working on a TV pilot, and pilots are supposed to move pretty quickly, right? Shooting for TV, but he spent the whole first day on one scene of a character sitting at a desk. And so I've seen this piece of footage that he shot, and it's the best scene in that pilot. So it's if you just let him do what he wants to do, his work's amazing. But people couldn't deal with it, whether financially, practically, or anything like that. So that's why stories circulated and people wanted them.
That's really interesting. Well,
Yeah.
okay, so keeping with this theme of projects that didn't work out, several people asked about the rumors or true stories behind Tobe Hooper at one point being attached to a Spider-Man project. And I know nothing about this. Do either of you have any dirt on that particular?
Yeah, it's a popular bit of lore because Canon was developing it They have many wacky ideas about their projects that aren't always very easy to take seriously. And so people, I think Joseph Stefano, the Outer Limits or Twilight Zone writer, the Outer Limits writer, was going to write the script. And it was going to be about a man who literally is turning into a spider, a la The Fly. But I've never seen corroboration of that. What I do know is that Hooper would speak about the film in interviews. In one interview, he only mentions producing it. He didn't intend on directing it. He was just, I'm going to produce this film in London. And it was going to shoot at the same time he was producing Texas Chainsaw. He was going to like produce two films at once. But eventually he had to direct Texas Chainsaw, and things fell through on Spider-Man. And then in another interview, he does mention gonna make it, hasn't directed, I believe. Anyway.
I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, it was one of those things where they would run an advertisement at Cannes for some, potential film. You're going to make another example would be David Cronenberg's Frankenstein. There's a whole ad campaign that was going to happen. So I'm not, but I do believe there's something a little more to it with Tobe. I think there was a treatment, and I think that he was seriously
he was
involved in the possibility, but it never went far.
Yeah, like he mentions, trying to look for a director and a screenwriter. So,
and I can't imagine what a Tobe Hooper Spider-Man film would look like.
I mean, I don't want to take away the idea that he wanted to make it hasn't directed. I'm sure it was floated at one point and he was into it because he seemed very involved, like you said, developing it.
I think that's true.
It sounds like it would have been very different from the Sam Raimi treatment of it. And I bring Sam Raimi up because another audience question compared Hooper to Sam Raimi, specifically looking at his early shorts like The Heisters, and the viewer felt like Hooper and Raimi shared some sensibilities, and I wondered what your all's take was on that. I feel like they have different influences, very different influences.
Well, they're different generations of filmmakers, for one thing. Heisters specifically, although I see why somebody might think, oh, that's kinetic and frenetic, in the way that Sam Raimi's work is. I'd compare it much more to David Lynch than to Sam Raimi. I think Heisters has a serious Lynchian quality, a decade before David Lynch even existed, really. So I think they are. I know that Raimi was very clearly influenced by Chainsaw Massacre on Evil Dead. No doubt about it. It's perfectly obvious. But his sensibility is far goofier.
Right.
He's the Three Stooges. Yeah. And Tobe is, Ingmar Bergman.
You mentioned Lynch as a point of comparison, and the movie that popped into my head as having a lot of kinship with Lynchian environments is Mortuary.
That's interesting.
In some ways, Mortuary is even darker than Lynch, but the off-kilter nature of the performances, the strangeness of the fact that this newly single mom is taking her kids across the country to open a mortuary and live in this dilapidated home with a mortuary in the basement next to a graveyard with two adolescent children. I mean, it's just a bizarre film, one of his funniest films, I think. I'll mention Chris Wifter writes about Mortuary a lot in the book, so I don't want to steal too many of his ideas, but I just love that movie. And I wasn't planning on bringing it up in this video, but since you mentioned a Lynchian comparison, it just popped into my head.
I hadn't thought of that, but I definitely see it. Yeah. And but also mentioning Mortuary reminds me of this comparison of him from film to film. You look at Toolbox Murders and Mortuary, which were made back to back, essentially. They're as different from each other as you can imagine.
Yeah, and
you look at Spontaneous Combustion and I'm Dangerous Tonight. back to back, as different from each other as you can possibly imagine. See that throughout his entire filmography.
And even more remarkable for Toolbox Murders and Mortuary because it's the same writer team.
Yeah.
Those two movies, and yet couldn't be more.
Correct. Completely different approach. Color scheme. And we haven't talked about Tobe's color theory.
Let's talk about color.
There's a whole book, I think, that could be had talking about, just look at.
You're saying there was a whole book.
No, there could be. You know,
We'll do a sequel.
Life Force is clearly,
Books
you
about
know,
it.
derived. I guess I'll have to write it. Life Force is clearly influenced by Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires,
For sure.
color scheme. And then you look at the garishness of Chainsaw Massacre 2 and the carnival-esque colors of Invaders from Mars and Funhouse, and maybe even the color drain in Chainsaw Massacre. You know, that's something entirely different. The man never repeated himself, but his color theory is fascinating. And again, Spontaneous Combustion with all those pinks and blues and lavenders and pastel colors and flame colors, all kind of in opposition to each other. The color carries the emotion and tells the story, the color alone. And I think that's true of all of his films. Look at Jin, his very last film, and it's all very, you know, chromatic and kind of subdued sepia tone, which is something that he had never done before. The man had no end of ideas about how color influences cinema.
Yeah, you know, I talked about this a little bit with Scout Tafoya about
Who?
This guy, he's some internet critic. But anyway, we were talking,
I love you, Scout.
we were talking about Hooper's novel, Midnight Movie, which I love a lot, co-written with Alan Goldshire, who also co-wrote Robert Englund's autobiography. And Hooper did the foreword to that. I don't know if that's how they got connected, but at any rate, one of the interesting things about Midnight Movie is that, and I went into detail about the book with Scout, so I'll just quickly say here, the book kind of incorporates in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way the big themes that the other so-called masters of horror directors are known for. Wes Craven's dream and nightmare imagery, Romero's zombies, Cronenbergian body horror. You've even got some connection to John Carpenter's cigarette burns, and as well as the Howard Hawksian buddy dynamic of the main characters, one of whom is a filmmaker named Tobe Hooper. I love this novel, and I recommend it to anybody watching. But to your point, one of the things that sets Hooper apart from these other filmmakers of this generation, all of whom are great filmmakers. This is in no way a criticism of them. But you can't really peg Hooper with a phrase like that. You don't think Hooper body horror, Hooper dream imagery, Hooper zombies. All of those filmmakers are way more than just those phrases, but also those filmmakers did so much with those tropes that they are permanently known for them. Hooper, on the other hand, as you say, the style changes. There are some themes, and this is really what our book is all about. There are some themes that run through everything, but no quick and easy tagline that you can say, this is what Tobe Hooper is best known for, stylistically, thematically, whatever. And yet, when you watch a Tobe Hooper movie, it feels like a Tobe Hooper movie. There's something, some kind of, there's you know, the word gets thrown around too much in criticism, but grittiness, there's this kind of atmosphere that I'm not sure that we completely articulated, and hopefully we'll do a sequel of that, more essays on Tobe Hooper. And I'm glad that so many books, you know, in 2021 and beyond are starting to trickle out. So
I would use the word disjointed.
Disjointed.
A good way.
Yeah, that's good. Disjointed is good.
Yeah. It's the freedom he uses to create projects. Like, I don't think any of his projects starts or ends the exact same way as it's first conceived or scripted. I think, yeah, I don't know how he gets to keep on doing that, but like, there's an aspect of him where he's very faithful to scripts and the contributions of his writer, and trying to just tell a good story and support the story and the material given to him. But it's the disjointedness comes in at some point, and that's what he does on set, adjustments he makes. Yeah. I don't think any other filmmaker works in the exact same way. It's in my opinion, it's a production model thing. It's a thing that he just, I mean, one of his favorite metaphor for how he sees a film set is it's a Indian war dance. So he said that numerous times. So
I heard him call it the circus a number of times.
okay. So
Yeah, and he does, and he mentions in an interview about the Peter Paul and Mary documentary, he refuses to call it a documentary. He calls it an assemblage in which Peter, Paul, and Mary happen to be there, and I guess it goes back a little bit to his roots as a kind of experimental filmmaker. Certainly Eggshells being a prime example of his early tendency, even tendency throughout his career, to try things differently, have interesting transitions and strange entries into scenes and so on. But I don't know, I may be reaching a little bit.
I don't think Tobe ever really considered himself a horror filmmaker.
Sure.
He just considered himself a filmmaker. It's just the case that, he hit big with Chainsaw, and those were the kinds of opportunities that presented themselves to him. And he made the most of them. It's not that he didn't delight in the horror aspects. He truly did. In fact, he pushed them further than I think anyone has ever before.
I wonder what would have happened. I remember there's a story about Wes Craven who agreed to do, I think it was Scream 3, agreed to do another Scream sequel in return for an opportunity to direct a straight drama, which became Music from the Heart with Meryl Streep and Gloria Estefan.
Dreadful movie.
oh, I don't know.
I like it.
Don't be that's
Well, we can-
the Wes Craven podcast.
Yeah, we'll save that analysis for another time. But I wonder what would have happened if Hooper had gotten the opportunity to make a middle of the road, mid-level budget studio drama of, about some troubled kids being mentored by a
Good-hearted urban teacher.
Right.
Well, I know he always wanted to make a period picture. That would
Oh,
have thrilled him no end.
yeah.
But in the end, it just wasn't meant to be.
I guess The Heisters was the closest he got to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's wonderful. Anyone who hasn't seen that needs to find it and check it
Yeah.
out. It's terrific.
I believe it is making the rounds on the internet, YouTube and whatnot.
Yes.
If he ever did start making mainstream pabulum, it would be the most disjointed, and he'd be one of those filmmakers who the auteur stamp is still there, even though, which exists,
I suppose you could say that some of his TV work, was close to straight drama. His episode of The Equalizer
Yeah.
is a good case in point, which I think he did extremely well.
Since we mentioned both Wes Craven and TV, one of the other questions from the live chat was about Hooper directing the first episode of Freddy's Nightmares. And I believe, Stan, you said you were on that set for a day?
Yeah, I was lucky enough. That whole period of time, I was, a family friend hanging out. And even if I wasn't working, I would visit the Tales from the Crypt set, apartment complex, and Freddy's Nightmares. Now, Freddy's Nightmares was fascinating because I've never seen a set move so fast.
Mm.
I mean, they had no money, but they were just cranking out shot after shot after shot after shot. I mean, literal moments from one to the next to the next to the next. Tobe seemed completely in control, but they had no money.
Yeah.
So what he could do was limited by the resources at hand. There's a lot to recommend about his episode of Freddy's Nightmares, but I do think it's problematic because of the budget.
Yeah, I was going to say that show really is threadbare. You can see it throughout the series, which is a shame given the premise of the series kind of requires some special effects investment. But that pilot is as you say, it makes it seems appropriate that it was a fast moving set because the episode is so fast moving.
They had a lot to get
in
a day, and I think that the shooting schedule was maybe 4 days total. Wow. I could be wrong about that, but it was very, very quick.
There's some moments in that like the catch-up moment. So yeah, it has his kind of sense of humor, his gallows sense of humor in there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's a fun piece of TV. That's another show that hasn't gotten a legitimate release in the United States yet, and I hope it does soon, because it is well worth seeing. And of course, as a Hooper completionist myself, my bootleg copy just doesn't look that good. I want to get.
I also have the bootleg.
Yeah. I mean, how good can they make it look? It was on TV 30 years ago.
That's true. I'm not expecting a 4K transfer or anything, but
I think the whole series was a bit of a misfire, and a bit of a misconception. And I don't want to be too critical here, but I didn't find much to recommend about any of the subsequent episodes.
We could talk a little bit about, I said this before, one of my favorite essays in our book is Songs in the Key of Death, Tobe Hooper's Dancing with Myself and Dance of the Dead by Jerry Metz. He writes one of the most entertaining analyses of the Billy Idol video that Hooper directed. One of the first, and Hooper, if I remember correctly, was the first, I think Jerry says this in his essay, was the first film director to direct a video for MTV. I think he beat John Landis's Thriller by a month or two.
That's true, but it's true.
Which
I just recently had the privilege of looking at a Billy Idol script. Billy Idol wrote the script for the video himself. Yes.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's kind of just a fascinating assortment of ideas and potential shots that Tobe kind of molded into, what you see.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for that. That was played again and again and again on MTV for years.
Yeah, and when you think about it, Dancing with Myself might be his second most influential work in terms of how many people saw and internalized the technique. Because when you look at music videos prior to Dancing with Myself, it's like the what's the name of that band, the Boggles, Video Killed the Radio Stars, these little performance videos, and they're cool and flashy and everything. But this film's got atmosphere and kind of an associative story to it. Certainly Thriller came along and is what it is. I refuse to talk about John Landis's work, but it's just a personal thing. No offense, Hollywood, but the Dance with Myself video is, I don't know, it's so much fun to watch. And you were talking, I cut you off because you were talking about seeing the script. Did any of the ideas that Mr. Idol contribute to the scripts find their way into the final video?
Virtually all of them.
Oh, really?
Okay. It is very much, Tobe taking those ideas and molding them Now, I wish Tony Hooper could participate because he was in fact on the set and in the video himself. So he would probably have a lot of stories to tell. I know very little.
We'll get him
Just
one
that
of these.
What I noticed was that the music video had a more conventional, from looking at that treatment, that idle treatment, it had a payoff to all the snippets at the beginning. You know, the guy who's gonna murder his wife, he decides not to, and then he and the family's like dancing happily at the end, and then like there's more shots of the woman in chains, she gets free or something like that. And I don't know, I think that's interesting because it kind of is another example of Hooper. He doesn't, I don't know if it's like a loss of stamina or like he gets to like the end and then he pulls back. Like there's lots of restraint in Hooper's work. Like he won't give the right payoffs. I don't know whether that's like a production thing but it makes his films more enigmatic. It makes them more interesting, actually, the fact that, but that music video had a happier ending.
Certainly. Well,
There was some talk, speaking of Billy Idol,
sure.
there was some talk that he was going to play one of the male vampires in Life Force.
Oh, that would have
It
been
was right around that same time frame. And in fact, when I went to the screening of Life Force at 20th Century Fox, Billy Idol was there. So he and Tobe had become pals. And I would have liked to have seen him in Life Force.
That would have been something. That would have been something. Well, speaking of happy endings, I could talk to you guys all day, but I know there's a limit to the internet's attention span. So we want to clock in at as close to an hour as we can. I want to thank you both for giving this extra time to talking about Hooper's work, Hooper's career, and going more into your own stuff. Stan Giesea's book, Smoldering Embers, on the set of Tobe Hooper's Spontaneous Combustion, will be coming out about a month from the posting of this video. So check that out. The Tobe Hooper Appreciation Society, or whatever search engine you care to use, type in the Tobe Hooper Appreciation Society and visit the work of Julius Banzon. There's so much cool stuff in there. I know Julius is going to get on here and say it's gone dormant, but there's so much to dig through.
Highly recommended.
Go there, spend time there.
It was at the beginning of exploration of Hooper's work, so I could be proud of it, at least that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks to University of Texas Press for hosting us again. And let me get this nice and close to the camera.
Absolutely.
The book is American Twilight, Cinema of Tobe Hooper, edited by Christopher Woofter and this guy, Will Dodson.
Much recommended.
It's got a lot of good stuff in it. We're real pleased with it.
It is excellent. It's awesome. Don't underplay it. It's fantastic.
Thank you very much. And thanks, of course, to Scout Tafoya and Mr. Joe Bob Briggs, who joined us for the original live stream. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I could talk for hours.
I appreciate it.